Look, I'm not saying I'm a saint, but I'm definitely not a criminal. Unless parking my perfectly functional, non-smelly, slightly beige van counts as a felony these days. And according to Agnes Peterson, the undisputed velvet-fisted tyrant of the Grandview Estates Homeowners Association, it absolutely did. My van, bless its boxy little heart, is a 2010 Econoline. I use it for my side hustle, restoring vintage arcade cabinets. It's got a few faded decals from the previous owner, a mobile dog groomer, R.I.P. Fluffy Cuts, but I keep it clean. It's necessary. It's not an eyesore. It is, however, about 2 inches too long and 2 shades too practical for the pristine, personality-free aesthetic Agnes demands. The first notice landed on my windshield with the weight of 1,000 judgments, clipped under my wiper blade like a passive-aggressive parking ticket. It wasn't even an envelope, just a neon yellow cardstock that screamed, "Violation. Commercial vehicle parking prohibited in driveways or street areas." I laughed. I actually snorted water through my nose. My van is registered for personal use, which I tried explaining to Agnes over an email that was probably too heavy on the exclamation points and too light on the corporate jargon she adores. Her reply was 2 hours later and 3 paragraphs long, citing Section 4, Subsection G, Paragraph 2, Line 45, which apparently defines a commercial vehicle based on its potential to be used for commerce, its general silhouette, and, I swear, its vibe. I'm serious. The vibe. I walked the dog that evening just to calm down, and I saw it. The entire Grandview Estates subdivision is a sea of bland conformity. Every house is some shade of beige, gray, or greige. The lawns are manicured to the millimeter. Even the kids' sidewalk chalk art looks suspiciously symmetrical. My van, sitting there like a slightly scuffed, useful beige brick, was a beacon of nonconformity. It was an insult to the HOA's rigid, soul-crushing vision of the American dream. My neighbor Gary was out watering his petunias, the only thing in his life that seemed to give him joy. He saw me staring at the notice. "Better move it, man," he muttered, glancing nervously toward Agnes's house, which looked suspiciously like a maximum security beige fortress. "She's serious this time. She got Henderson on the corner last month for having his recycling bin visible before 6 p.m. "It's a van, Gary. It's how I pay the bills," I hissed. "To Agnes, it's a mobile declaration of independence," Gary whispered back. "And we all know how the HOA feels about independence." He adjusted his straw hat and scurried inside. Useless, but probably right. I decided to appeal. I went to the HOA meeting that Tuesday. It was held in the community clubhouse, which smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner and suppressed rage. The board sat elevated on a small stage, Agnes presiding like a pint-sized Queen Victoria in a power suit. The meeting started with a 20-minute diatribe about the new pool furniture regulations. My anxiety was building faster than the late fees on my eventual fine. Finally, the open forum arrived. "Item Alpha 7, Agnes announced, her voice as dry and brittle as the dead leaves Gary meticulously swept off his driveway. Regarding the continued parking infraction at 1445 Briarwood Lane. Mr. Protagonist's name, you have 5 minutes. I stood up, holding my registration papers. "Yes, hello. I just want to clarify that my vehicle, the 2010 Econoline, is legally registered for personal use in the state of—" Agnes cut me off with a sharp clack of her gavel. "Mr. Protagonist's name, the board is not concerned with the state's opinion, which is governed by the public good. We are concerned with the community good, which is governed by the CC&Rs you signed." Article 4 clearly states that vehicles designed or commonly used for commercial transport, including but not limited to vans with excessive height or panel-style bodies, are prohibited. Excessive height? I looked around at the bored, gray faces in the audience. It's a standard van. It's slightly shorter than her neighbor's ridiculously huge SUV. We have pictures, Board Member 2 chimed in, projecting a grainy photo of my van next to a picture of an Amazon delivery truck. It was an absurd comparison. It looks exactly like a commercial vehicle, Mr. Protagonist's name, Agnes concluded, folding her hands with maddening finality. And its presence detracts from the uniform residential character of Grandview Estates. We are upholding the fine and ordering immediate compliance. You have 7 days to remove the van from the property. Next item, the acceptable mulch colors for Phase 3. I was shut down. Humiliated. My perfectly functional beige van was now a ticking time bomb of fines. I trudged home, muttering curses under my breath. I lost the battle, but as I stood in my driveway, staring at the offending vehicle, the rage boiled over into something cold and strategic. I had 7 days. I wasn't moving the van. I was going to move the goalposts. I was going to declare a holy war on vinyl siding. The next day, I didn't move the van. Instead, I started researching. I dove into the darkest, most dusty corners of municipal and state codes. I read everything: zoning ordinances, property tax exemptions, historical preservation rules, and then, as a joke, religious non-profit status. That's when the light bulb came on. It wasn't a gentle glow. It was a 1,000-watt explosion-in-the-brain moment. Property tax exemption for religious institutions, zoning exemption for places of worship, First Amendment right to assemble and practice faith. The absurdity of it was delicious. It was either move the van to a storage unit the size of a shoebox or declare a holy war on vinyl siding. I chose the holy war. My mission? To register my house. 1445 Briarwood Lane as a legitimate tax-exempt place of worship. The first step was structural. To sell the illusion, I needed a few visible changes. I couldn't just hang a sign and call it a day. I needed a contractor, which led to my first encounter with Mitch the Mason. Mitch showed up driving a beat-up Ford F-150 that clearly was commercial, which I took as a good omen. He was a guy built like a cinder block with a perpetual look of mild confusion on his face. "So, you want me to brick up this garage window?" Mitch confirmed, scratching his beard, "and install a slightly grander-than-average double door here." "That's right, Mitch, but I need you to understand something crucial about this project," I said, leaning in conspiratorially. "This isn't just a garage. This is going to be the sanctuary annex." Mitch blinked slowly. "The... what?" "The sanctuary annex, Mitch. I'm turning my home into a church, well, part of it, a place of worship." Mitch stared at me, then at my vanilla-colored house, then at my beige van. He pulled his safety glasses up onto his forehead. "You gonna be preaching in there? Like, actual sermons?" "Absolutely, theologically sound, if somewhat unorthodox, sermons," I assured him, nodding gravely. "We're going to be focusing on the gospel of the utility vehicle, Mitch. A sermon about tolerance, community service, and the unalienable right to park your perfectly decent van in your own damn driveway." Mitch squinted at the blueprints I'd hastily drawn up. "Look, man, I've poured concrete for Baptist churches, synagogues, a Buddhist monastery, and even a couple of cults that went belly up after the IRS showed up. I don't care what you're building, as long as you pay. But this is different." It's divinely inspired, Mitch, I said. Now, about that stone facade for the Welcome Center. We hammered out the price, and Mitch, though clearly believing I'd lost a screw or two, agreed to start on Monday. The key was to make the changes just dramatic enough to be noticeable, but small enough to avoid triggering a full-blown zoning review before I had the paperwork. The paperwork. That was the truly fun part. I walked into City Hall with my briefcase full of determination and my stomach full of anxiety. I was directed to the Zoning and Permitting Department, specifically to Brenda from Zoning. Brenda looked like someone who had given up on joy sometime around 1998. She wore a name tag that said Brenda in Times New Roman font. "How can I help you?" she droned, not looking up from her monitor. "Yes, Brenda. I'm here to formally register a new religious institution," I said, trying to sound as somber and official as possible. Brenda finally looked up. Her expression suggested I'd just handed her a live grenade. "A what?" "Sir, this is zoning. We handle permits for sheds, decks, and minor additions. Religious institutions are usually handled by—" She trailed off, flipping through a very thin binder. "I have the Articles of Incorporation for the First Church of Vehicle Parking Tolerance and Non-Conforming Lawn Ornaments," I announced, sliding a neatly typed document across the desk. I'd spent 6 hours writing the Tenets of the Faith, which included, I'm proud to say, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's driveway space," and "A good work vehicle is a blessed tool." Brenda stared at the document, her lips moving silently as she read the name. This is an official non-profit entity." "It is, Brenda. We are dedicated to promoting neighborhood peace through the radical acceptance of utilitarian transport solutions," I recited, leaning on the counter. "I simply need the documentation filed with the city for the property tax exemption application and to confirm the residential zoning overlay allows for a recognized place of worship, which I believe it does." I handed her the relevant section of the city code, the one that, in an effort to avoid lawsuits, made it nearly impossible to deny a legitimate church, no matter where it was located. Brenda spent the next 45 minutes consulting with 3 different supervisors, all of whom kept shooting glances at my van, which was visible through the City Hall window. The tension was palpable. My fate hinged on a city employee's willingness to push a button. Finally, Brenda sighed, stamped one of the forms with a sound that seemed to register deep personal defeat, and slid it back. "The paperwork is filed, sir. You are officially designated as a non-profit organization operating a place of worship at 1445 Briarwood Lane." I actually let out a small, quiet, triumphant whoop. "Thank you, Brenda. May the spirit of the Econoline guide your way." I practically floated out of City Hall. The van was safe. Agnes and the board, however, were not amused. Mitch's team started work on Monday morning, hammering and drilling. It was minor construction, but in the sterile silence of Grandview Estates, it sounded like a full-scale invasion. Agnes was on my porch by 10 a.m., her face the color of an unripe plum. "What is the meaning of this, Mr. Protagonist's name?" she demanded, gesturing wildly at the half-bricked window. "Good morning, Agnes. You're catching me right in the middle of a major project," I chirped, far too happy for a Monday. "You see, I'm exercising my First Amendment rights. My vehicle was deemed commercial, which I took as a sign, a spiritual calling, if you will. I have converted my property into a place of worship." I handed her a brochure I'd printed up. It featured a terrible clip art image of a dove flying over a van. Agnes's eyes narrowed to tiny slits. "Don't be ridiculous. You cannot simply declare your house a church." Ah, but I can, Agnes, I corrected gently. And I have. Here are the filed non-profit documents from the state, and here is the zoning confirmation from the city. We're tax-exempt, protected by the First Amendment, and the PSUM. Construction is simply to create a more suitable sanctuary annex. She didn't explode. She imploded. She sputtered. She gasped. And then she launched into phase 1 of retaliation. Over the next 3 days, my mailbox was stuffed with violations. Excessive noise during meditation hours, 7 o'clock a.m., 10 a.m. I was fined $50 for Mitch's saw, improper color palette for a religious institution. They claimed the beige brick was spiritually deficient. I wish I was making this up. Parking of the commercial vehicle in a manner that obstructs the view of construction. The van was still perfectly parked in the driveway. I ignored them all. I didn't even dignify them with a snarky email. I just started collecting them for my eventual bonfire of bureaucratic absurdity. The conflict was escalating. The van was still there, but now, thanks to the HOA, it was essentially a holy relic. I needed one more piece of visible, physical evidence to cement my church's legitimacy and drive Agnes absolutely bonkers. I needed a sign. The sign arrived on Thursday. It was 4 feet wide, 3 feet tall, and made of that cheap, slightly wavy corrugated plastic you see at political rallies. It was mounted on 2 wooden posts and, crucially, planted squarely in the middle of my perfectly manicured lawn, a direct violation of the HOA's minimal yard decor rule, which, thank God, did not apply to religious signage. It read, "The First Church of Vehicle Parking Tolerance Services, MWHF, at 7:00 a.m. Parking lot blessing follows. All are welcome, except HOA board members." It was tacky, slightly crooked, and perfectly legal. It was my Sistine Chapel. The neighbors were split. Poor Gary looked like he was going to have an aneurysm trying to decide if he should be horrified or proud. Mrs. Rodriguez from down the street actually stopped and took a selfie with it. I was gaining congregants and allies. The board, of course, went nuclear. They saw the sign, they saw the van, and they saw their precious community descending into a state of visible, beige-defying rebellion. They didn't even bother with a fine notice this time. They went straight for the big guns. They called the police. I was in my sanctuary annex, aka the garage, touching up the paint on an old Pac-Man machine when I heard the dreaded sound, the whomp-whomp of a car door closing that wasn't mine. I peered out the window and saw a cruiser parked on the street. A uniformed officer was walking toward my house, guided by the frantic, pointy finger of Agnes Peterson. My stomach dropped. This was it. The real tension. Getting the city to approve the papers was one thing. Having a man in uniform show up was another. I put on my best benevolent, non-offending citizen face and walked outside. "Officer, can I help you?" I asked, calm as a cucumber that's been practicing meditation for 10 years. Officer Dale, a beefy guy who looked like he'd rather be eating a donut than dealing with suburban politics, eyed me wearily. "I'm Officer Dale. We received a complaint about illegal commercial activity and unauthorized structures at this residence." Agnes immediately jumped in, her voice high and squeaky. "He's running a business, officer. He's using that unsightly van for commercial purposes, and now he's trying to hide it behind this frivolous religious display." I held up my hand, stopping Agnes mid-screech. "Officer, I can assure you there is no illegal commercial activity. I am the founder, primary theologian, and custodian of the First Church of Vehicle Parking Tolerance. The van is legally parked in my driveway, and it is the official transport vehicle for our outreach ministry." I didn't wait for him to respond. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crisp, official documents from City Hall, the ones Brenda stamped. I handed them to him. "Here is the certificate of incorporation for our nonprofit," I said. "And here is the zoning confirmation recognizing this residence as a place of worship." Officer Dale took the papers, flipping through them with the practiced boredom of someone who's seen it all. He read the full, ridiculous name of the church, and a muscle twitched in his cheek. He looked at the sign, then at the van, then back at Agnes, whose face was now a truly terrifying shade of purple. "Ma'am," Officer Dale said to Agnes, his tone firming up with annoyance, "your HOA rules cannot override state law or the First Amendment protections afforded to a place of worship. This gentleman has the necessary filings for a non-profit and a recognized place of worship operating in a residential zone." "But the van," Agnes stammered. "The van," Officer Dale repeated flatly, "is legally parked on private property that is now recognized as belonging to a religious institution. Unless you have proof of a verifiable crime, a permit violation from a non-HOA body, or a threat to public safety, this is a civil matter. Frankly, it's a waste of my time." He handed the papers back to me, got into his cruiser, and drove away. He didn't even turn on his lights. The silence Agnes left behind was monumental. She stood there, defeated, before turning and marching stiffly back to her maximum security beige fortress. The Battle of the Van was officially over. But the war for the soul of Grandview Estates was just beginning. The board, I knew, would try to shut down the church itself. They would force my hand. They would force me to hold a service. I had to prepare. I had to preach. I spent the evening in the sanctuary annex, researching sermon structures and theology. It was frantic, hilarious work. I drafted an entire service around the theme of "Thou shalt not judge the panel van by the decals of its former life." My trusty neighbor Gary, emboldened by the police interaction, brought me a 6-pack of beer and a bag of chips. "I'll come to your service," he said, adjusting his straw hat, "but only if you promise to. Talk about the acceptable height of hedgerows. That's been a source of spiritual anguish for me." "Consider it on the agenda, Brother Gary," I replied. That Sunday morning, I was dressed in a black turtleneck and a gold chain that I felt gave me a vaguely televangelist vibe. The congregation was 8 people: Gary, Mrs. Rodriguez, a student from the nearby college who heard about the drama on Twitter, and 5 other neighbors who were just curious. Then the media showed up. A reporter from the local online news outlet, the Suburban Scrutiny, showed up with a small camera crew. The service itself was chaotic, satirical, and profound. I preached. The HOA board came to me and said, "Your vehicle is commercial." But I say to them, everything we do is for commerce, the commerce of the spirit, the commerce of community, and yes, the literal commerce that allows us to afford these overpriced beige houses. Do we judge the delivery driver by the length of their wheelbase? No. We judge them by the quality of the service they provide. The service of the van is tolerance. The neighbors laughed. The camera crew grinned. And then the reporter shoved a microphone in my face. "Sir, are you really running a church, or is this simply a very elaborate protest against the HOA?" I looked directly into the camera lens, gave the reporter my most beatific smile, and said, "Is not all true faith a form of elaborate protest against an arbitrary, unjust system? We're just trying to save our souls and our driveways. The truth is, the board has shown that they are hostile to my van, which is the cornerstone of my ministry. That is a spiritual attack. And in our doctrine, there is only one response to a direct spiritual attack." I paused for dramatic effect. The camera was rolling. "We must fight back." and we have the power. The community was buzzing. I had secured my legal status and gained public sympathy. But the board was still technically in power, and they would not let this go. I needed to finish them, once and for all. I needed the final, decisive power move. The emergency HOA meeting was called for the following Tuesday. The subject line in the email was all caps, "Vote to revoke non-conforming structure. Status and immediate litigation proceedings." The community clubhouse was packed. People stood 3 deep along the walls, ready for the main event. I walked in late, right as Agnes was starting her opening remarks. I wasn't wearing my turtleneck. I was wearing an actual second-hand, slightly shiny, dark red velvet smoking jacket, the closest thing I owned to vestments. I sat in the front row, directly across from the board. Agnes looked furious but composed. She started by summarizing the atrocity. "As you are all aware," she announced, her voice shaking slightly with contained fury, "Mr. Protagonist's name has engaged in a deliberately provocative and disingenuous attempt to circumvent the Grandview Estate's CCNRs by fabricating a so-called church on his property. This is a fraud. It is an insult to true faith, and it is a clear violation of the spirit of our community bylaws." She introduced their lawyer, a slick man in a gray suit, who looked like he hadn't experienced a genuine emotion since 1995. "Good evening," the lawyer said, adjusting his tie. "The board intends to file a civil suit immediately, seeking a declaratory judgment that the formation of the First Church of Vehicle Parking Tolerance is merely a sham transaction, and that its presence is a private nuisance that materially interferes with the peaceful enjoyment of the community. We are confident we will win, as the courts will see through this blatant attempt at a loophole." He finished with a smug smile. Agnes beamed. This was their ace, the courts. They were going to bleed me dry in litigation. "Agnes," I said, standing up calmly. My voice was quiet, but it carried in the crowded room. "If I may speak, as a fellow property owner, and more importantly, a registered ecclesiastical authority." Agnes hated that phrase. "You have 3 minutes, Mr. Protagonist's name. Stay on topic." "I intend to stay entirely on topic, Agnes. The topic is spiritual leadership and governance," I said, ignoring the board's lawyer entirely. "We, the First Church of Vehicle Parking Tolerance, are dedicated to a simple principle. Live and let park. Our faith is protected. Our structure is zoned, and our vehicle is blessed. The question is not whether my actions are legal, but whether yours are moral and just." I paused. The room was silent. "The board argues that I am interfering with the peaceful enjoyment of the community. But I ask you, who here has enjoyed being nitpicked about the height of their bird feeder? Who has enjoyed the threat of a fine because their children left a basketball hoop out too late? Who has enjoyed paying dues to a group that operates not for community enjoyment, but for its own self-righteous, petty power?" A few murmurs rose from the back of the room. Gary gave a hearty, if slightly nervous, "Hear, hear." I leaned forward, placing my hands dramatically on the table. "The board, and specifically its officers, have repeatedly acted against the tenets of the First Church of Vehicle Parking Tolerance. They have engaged in slander, harassment, and what we in our spiritual texts call sins of excessive rectitude. The constant issuance of frivolous fines, the calling of the police for a civil matter, and the attempt to undermine a legitimate faith organization, this is a direct spiritual attack." Agnes stood up. This is irrelevant grandstanding, Mr. Protagonist's name. You are wasting our time. On the contrary, Agnes, I am exercising my rights as an ecclesiastical governor, I said, pulling out a final, official-looking document printed on slightly yellowish paper with a decorative border. It was my masterpiece. I have determined that the current actions and attitudes of the HOA Board of Directors, Agnes Peterson, Robert Miller, and Susan Chen, constitute a clear and present danger to the spiritual health of the community and are in direct violation of our core religious principles. I held the document aloft. Therefore, in my capacity as founder and ecclesiastical governor of the First Church of Vehicle Parking Tolerance, I hereby issue Papal Edict No. 1. I read it aloud, my voice ringing with mock authority. Papal Edict No. 1. By the power vested in me by the state of state name and the supreme authority of parking tolerance, I hereby declare the entire sitting board of directors, Agnes Peterson, Robert Miller, and Susan Chen, to be excommunicated from the immediate governance of this community. The room erupted. Gasps, then laughter, then applause. Furthermore, the excommunicated are subject to a spiritual fine for the sins of excessive rectitude, which shall immediately nullify all previous, current, and future fines levied by them against any member of this community, specifically including the charges related to the blessed vehicle parked at 1445 Briarwood Lane. I slammed the paper down on the table in front of Agnes. You lose, Agnes. Legally, the board has the power to manage the property. But if you try to fine me again, or take me to court, I will claim religious persecution. Your lawyer knows that filing a lawsuit against a tax-exempt place of worship is a First Amendment quagmire that will cost the HOA 5 times the annual dues and make national news. Your private nuisance claim just became a public religious persecution scandal. The board's lawyer was frozen, his mouth slightly ajar. He realized the horrifying truth. My stunt had weaponized the First Amendment against the HOA. He would be laughed out of court. Agnes, Robert, and Susan, realizing they were defeated by a man in a velvet jacket and a beige van, stood up in unison. They didn't argue. They just stormed out of the clubhouse, followed by their stunned and silent lawyer. The crowd went wild. I had won. Life returned to a new normal. A better normal. The van is still parked in the driveway. It is, for all intents and purposes, a holy relic. The absurd sign remains, though I've added a small, tasteful, or as tasteful as corrugated plastic can be, amendment beneath the main title. Board-free parking zone since date of excommunication. Agnes resigned a week later. Robert and Susan followed suit. The new interim board is composed of Gary, the new treasurer, Mrs. Rodriguez, and a guy who owns a Harley-Davidson and wants to petition for the right to build a small, tasteful, possibly tiki-themed fence around his pool. Things are looking up. The spiritual war had a physical toll. The bricking of the window and the new, oversized double door on the sanctuary annex remain. Sometimes I go in there, sit on my rolling arcade stool, and just look at the Pac-Man machine. It's the most peaceful room in the whole house, now that I know no one can find me for using it to restore old games. The most hilarious part is that I've actually stumbled into a new side hustle. Not arcades, but consulting. I get emails almost weekly from people across the country dealing with petty, tyrannical HOAs. Dear Reverend Protagonist's name, one email read, I was fined for the color of my mailbox. Can I register my house as a Church of Mailbox Freedom? I guess being a spiritual leader is a lot like being a plumber, only you deal with souls instead of clogged toilets. I write back with helpful, non-legal advice suggestions about non-profit formation and zoning codes, always ending with a cheerful, "May the spirit of the Econoline guide your way." I charge a small, non-taxable spiritual guidance fee. I won, not because I was right, but because I realized the bureaucracy that empowered the HOA was also riddled with loopholes big enough to drive a slightly beige, panel-style commercial van through. I fought their absurd rules with an even more absurd, but perfectly legal counter-rule. The sun sets over Grandview Estates now, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns. I stand in my driveway, looking at my van, and I feel a swell of genuine, non-sarcastic pride. It's a testament to the fact that even in the most stiflingly conformist places, a little bit of creative rebellion, a lot of spite, and a well-researched legal loophole can truly save your soul. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get back inside. I'm thinking about starting a new sermon series, The Gospel of the Utility Trailer and the Right to Temporary Outdoor Storage. I need to make sure Gary's petunias get a prominent mention. After all, what is the First Amendment if not the right to park your van and worship your flowers in peace?